eyes on Iran, let's talk oil. Last weekend, the U.S. entered a conflict between Iran and Israel that has been simmering for months. Washington launched a strike on Iranian nuclear sites, causing oil prices to surge. But prices quickly dropped after a weak Iranian response. Some worried about disruption to the flow of oil through the Strait of Hormuz. For now, the strait remains open. All of which points to the shifting nexus between energy and geopolitics, and it raises to me the real question of the moment. What does the Middle East conflict say about global energy markets? Joining us now is Dr. Daniel Yergin, Vice Chairman of S&P Global and Pulitzer Prize-winning author of The Prize, and he is also author of a more recent book, The New Map, Energy, Climate, and the Clash of Nations. Dr. Yergin, welcome to the call.
Thank you, Jay. Glad to be with you, and thanks to the Chamber for the opportunity.
Daniel, let's start with the conflict itself. What's your read on the U.S. bombing, and is there still a possibility that Iran responds in a way that threatens the flow of oil?
So far, of course, the Iranian response was, as they say, performative. It showed that they had responded. They attacked with warning an American air base, the largest one in the Middle East. I think that always there's been a threat for half a century to the Strait of Hormuz, but the Iranians didn't do anything to disrupt it for a couple of reasons. One, it would have hurt their main customer for oil, which is China, which gets altogether 5 million barrels a day of supply from going through the Strait of Hormuz. And two, it would have hurt themselves because they export 1.5 million barrels a day, major source of revenue. And it would have led to a retaliation, no doubt, against their own oil infrastructure. So the worry's there. The worry about the Strait of Hormuz has been there for half a century, but it was not something that the Iranians at this point were going to take a risk on.
Do you think there's still a possibility that they might resort to that if things get a little more heated again?
Uh, that always that possibility is there, but I think the constraints are there as well. There's also always a chance that a kind of freelance group will do something. But it's also true that for half a century, the U.S. Navy has been preparing to clear the strait if necessary.
Now, Dan, we're putting up a chart that to me shows perhaps one of the biggest geopolitical developments of the last decade. Thanks to the shale revolution, which you describe beautifully in your most recent book, the U.S. has become the world's greatest oil producer, more than either Saudi Arabia or Russia. It's also a major exporter. Now, during the recent turmoil in the Middle East, prices were volatile for a moment, but they seem to have settled very quickly. And one of our members is asking, why didn't we see more disruption? Another, say, 1973-style oil shock or something along those lines.
Well, I think fundamental change in 1973 or even 79, the U.S. was a major importer of oil. That chart you showed is really quite amazing. It would not have been expected. The U.S. The only question was how much higher was U.S. oil imports going to be? And the shale revolution was transformative. It changed the physical balance in the global market. It changed the geopolitical balances we've seen, and it changed this psychological balance. And I think that's one reason why oil prices went up, as inevitably they would with a conflict of this intensity in the Middle East. They didn't stay up, and there was no disruption of supply. The growth of U.S. shale is a great balancer for the world market.
So in effect, the U.S.'s supply is a calming effect on the market. It provides a floor and a ceiling to prices then, and provides us a little bit of a buffer against this sort of volatility.
Exactly. It is a stabilizer. And I think your word a buffer, we saw in 2019 when Iranian proxies attacked this huge oil production facility in Saudi Arabia, the market went up for a day or two and then came down. And that's when it was really, to me, shined a light on how the market had changed because of the changed position of the United States.
Okay, well, that leads to what I call an America First question here. If Iran shuts down the Strait of Hormuz, should we spend blood and treasure to keep it open? I mean, we've got our own oil. Why should we care?
Well, if that's a big if they did and if they could, it's because basically it is still fundamental to the world economy. It would be hugely disruptive if those supplies were shut off. And so and remember, the U.S. is still highly integrated into the world market. So the price of oil in the U.S. reflects what happens in the world market. And people would be surprised to know, actually, the U.S. has become one of the world's largest oil exporters because we export some product, some liquids, and import others. That's why we're we're net, but we actually are quite connected to the world market in multiple ways.
Now, the Middle East countries, particularly those in the Gulf, have been trying for years to diversify away from commodity-based economies and trying to decrease their reliance on oil. How much progress have they made on that?
Well, I think the decades, but it's really accelerated. It really started with the UAE, where they had a 2030 program in like 2007. It's accelerated with Saudi Arabia. We did a study at S&P a couple of years ago, and more of the GDP of the United Arab Emirates was non-oil than oil. And certainly the crown prince in Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman, is pushing diversification. But I think one of the kind of learning positions is you need oil revenues in order to diversify away from oil. And it doesn't happen overnight.
I see. Okay, well, let's talking about these global markets. Russia, of course, has very close ties with Iran. They also are a major oil exporter. But I wonder, with this notion of, or this observation of the U.S. being now the largest oil exporter has really impacted Russia's geopolitical outlook. And I wonder if you might be able to tell us
Yeah,
how that.
yes. In the new map, I tell the story. In 2013, I was at the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum, which was Putin's version of Davos. And he was up there with Angela Merkel. And then they gave me the first question to ask. And I asked him the obvious question: your budget is over dependent on oil. By accident, I mentioned shale. And he started shouting at me in front of 3,000 people that shale is barbaric, it's terrible, it's awful. And, not a comfortable position to be shouted at by Vladimir Putin, especially in front of that number of people. And afterwards, I reflected on it and realized that, first of all, he saw shale gas would compete with Russian gas, and that the shale revolution would augment the influence of the United States overall geopolitically. And both those points were true. And it was proved home a decade later when Russia invaded Ukraine. And Putin thought he could use Russian energy as natural gas to Europe as the energy weapon, shut it off and shatter the Ukrainian coalition. And it failed. And one of the main reasons it failed was because of US shale gas, LNG. From the United States, liquefied natural gas, which has been about half of the total imports of LNG by Europe. And so, Putin was in his own diabolical way, very prescient to know that shale would change the game. And it changed the game in a way that I think was one of his major miscalculations with the invasion of Ukraine.
We've got an interesting question here from a member that helps us pivot, I think, into a broader discussion about the energy markets. How are companies pricing hydrocarbon uncertainty, and speaking specifically here about access and price, into their long-term plans? Does this meaningfully drive large corporates towards low-carbon solutions and technologies?
By that, are you asking about the energy producers or energy consumers?
I think it's on, and he's asking about the consumers on this end and
Well, I think that large consumers worry about the volatility. For them, the big worry is price spike goes up, affects gasoline prices, then that affects sales of automobiles and so forth. But I think we're now going through a period when companies are kind of rethinking what might have been their position on energy transition of a couple of years ago, realizing that the kind of thinking of the early of a few years ago about the speed and scale of the energy transition, that it's going to take longer, be more complicated, and cost more. And we see that wind and solar have increased, but the new numbers have just come out in 2024. Also, oil, natural gas, and coal also increased as well. So I think we see a kind of recalibration going on, and that's an issue for in terms of the electricity supplies that will be needed for the AI revolution.
okay, before we get into
And
that,
if I could just add on
yeah,
that,
please,
and
yes.
in particular, we're seeing a recalibration, a recognition that natural gas is going to play a larger role in our economy, particularly in electric generation.
So I take it from what you're saying, and this goes into our next question here from one of our members, that the energy world is no longer a choice between renewables and carbon fuels, but it's more of an all of the above moment now that we're facing.
Yeah, and instead of energy transition by itself, or really the idea of energy transition has to be redefined, it has to be rethought, and it really is also energy addition at the same time. And I was just in Asia, in Southeast Asia, they pointed out that European electricity demand has been flat for the last 20 years. It's grown, it's tripled in the same period in that part of the developing world. So they need energy to support economic growth.
So some of these changes now are pretty massive. I'm just wondering, one of our readers or members is asking, does Dr. Yergin sense that some enthusiasm for strict emission rules like Europe's CBAM, which is for carbon border adjustment mechanism, which is effectively a tariff, from what I understand, is looking increasingly impractical given rising energy needs? And you mentioned,
Uh,
the AI
It
and
is, it is quite right. It's a carbon tariff, and the Europeans say that they're doing it also to protect their industry, but it's also to project their views on climate change and policy on the developing world. Not well received. We had the head of the chief energy commissioner from the EU at our SEER Week conference in Houston in March, and he said, we're absolutely moving ahead and committed to CBAM, but a lot of pushback from the developing countries who really see it as discriminatory and imposing a cost on them that the Europeans are doing. So I think the CBAM, as it's called, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, is controversial, and particularly as it gets implemented. And because the developing world, we just heard it at our Energy Asia conference last week in Malaysia, saying, Northwest Europe should not be imposing their policies on us when we face economic growth issues that they don't.
Right, and I think it's worth noting the Chamber's position on this is that we welcome the goals of managing our carbon footprint, but we just want to do so in ways that doesn't have unintended consequences.
And that are disruptive of world trade.
Exactly. Yes. And we've now got one. This gets into the area of critical minerals. One of our members is asking, will the Iran conflict have any effect on the flow of critical minerals and all of the discussion of that in recent months?
Well, not, no, but there, I'll tell you here in Washington over the last 2 months, the intensity of conversation on critical minerals has really become much greater. Obviously, it's been highlighted by the trade negotiations between the U.S. and Japan, and particularly the Chinese control. Did I say U.S. Japan, U.S. China, and the Chinese control, really the lock that they have on rare earths, which is of great concern to U.S. Industry and to the U.S. military. And it's something, and it's compounded by AI. The main leading study that I'm involved in now is on the role of copper, which is the metal of electrification, the role of copper in the age of AI. And, you look at minerals in general, and China has a predominant position. And so that's one area of where the geopolitical tensions have become very apparent.
And how ready is the United States for this increased demand in copper? My understanding it takes a long time to open up a new copper mine here
Well,
in this
we did
country.
a study looking at how long it takes to open a new mine. On average, around the world, it's about 16 years. In the U.S., it's 29 years. The Supreme Court has given a go-ahead to this Resolution Copper project in Arizona, which would be a very big project. There's still other challenges to it, but the permit is part of the general issue that the United States faces about permitting reform, which I know the Chamber is very concerned about, is an absolute priority for the economy of the United States.
You had mentioned China earlier. How long does it take for China to open up a new mine?
China can do everything very quickly, and they don't have judicial reviews. They don't once it's decided, it goes ahead, and they'll go, you know, 24/7 to get it done. So of course, a lot of the mines that Chinese companies operate are around the world, but when you get to processing, that's where it's really concentrated in China.
So we mentioned China's overseas. It's still very dependent on energy sources overseas. And how much is one of our members is asking? How much is China's overseas push, the Belt and Road, et cetera, driven by its need for foreign sources of energy?
Well, I think that's one of it. China is very conscious. China is where the U.S. used to be actually even worse position. It imports 75% of its oil. That's one of the main drivers for its electrification of transportation, electric cars. So I think energy is a very important part of it. Markets for its huge industrial production capacity is a second thing. And thirdly, it's geopolitical influence. It's binding countries to China's vision of a new international order. So all of those are at work there.
Now, China has this unique development model that allows it to direct investment to strategic industries in a massive way, and they seem to be very focused on the core of the new renewables industry, whether it's solar panels or batteries or that sort of thing. How do you see that playing out in the months and years ahead?
Xi Jinping has actually said that they want to kind of dominate the new industrial supply chains. That's more or less a direct quote from him. Uh, we can see it right now with the advance of the Chinese electric cars. They're spreading, we're going to see them really, I think, showing up in markets around the world. You hear from people in Pakistan, you hear from people in Brazil. They're, impressive cars. Significant growing part of Mexican car imports are coming from China right now. So they dominate the solar panel market 80, 90%. Obviously, we talked about rare earths. They're moving aggressively in wind, and they have a very strong leadership position in batteries. And it's a combination of both the state control, state regulation, and these kind of entrepreneurial Chinese companies that might have started 10, 15 years ago. You take the leading battery company, it really only got going about 15 years ago, but it's two Chinese battery companies really are the lead players in the world today.
All right, well, we'll be watching these energy fault lines closely in the weeks ahead. But before we wrap, what's your biggest unanswered question in your mind right now? What are you worried about? What keeps you up at night as you look at
Well,
the earth?
I think energy security is always a fundamental question. We tend to think about it in oil and gas. I think we have to think about electric power, both from a cyber threat, but also an investment, and that the amount of electricity capacity that's going to be needed for AI is going to really put a lot of pressure on the electric power system. We estimate today about 4% of US electricity goes to data centers. Within 5 years, we say 10%, others say even higher. So I think understanding and ensuring, it goes back to the permitting question, that we have the electricity capacity in place to support the way our economy is going is a critical question for the future.
Well, you've been pointing the way forward in this industry since you first published the prize so long those years ago, and I really appreciate you joining us today, Dr. Daniel Yergin, Vice Chairman of S&P Global and Pulitzer Prize-winning author. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, our audience has gotten their shot of informational espresso and is ready to tackle the day. And if you've missed a live episode, catch the replay on our website, LinkedIn, or on YouTube. You can also listen to the call's podcast edition on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you to you, our members, for joining us today. This has been The Call, brought to you by the Global Intelligence Desk, asking the right questions to navigate uncertain times.